Seja bem-vindo, todo mundo. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or evening, depending on what time zone you're in. So my name is Timmons Roberts. I'm director of CSSN. Oh, we are recording. Okay, good. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Stephanie, for setting this up. Thank you, Carlos, for doing this event. I am very excited to hear about Brazil after Bolsonaro and what it means for climate change action. And we have a really distinguished and engaged scholar here to tell us about it. And I'm grateful to Carlos for doing this. So Carlos Milani, I mean, the list is incredible of the stuff he does. He's associate professor at State University of Rio de Janeiro in the Institute for Social and Political Studies. He's vice director of that institute. He's a research fellow with CNPq, or the National Research Council. He's a coordinator of the World Political Analysis Lab, the Observatorio Interdisciplinario, or whatever it's called, Interdisciplinary Watch on Climate Change. I'm looking at an English version here. He's also co-chair of our Climate Social Science Network Working Group on Natural Resources, Energy, and Climate Obstruction in the Global South, which a bunch of us here are part of. And it goes on and on. And so I was looking up his formation, his studies. He's a graduate of social sciences and juridical sciences from the Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro. Oh, no, sorry, Rio Grande do Sul. And then he did a master's, it looks like in preparation for a career as a diplomat from the Ministry of Foreign Relations of Institute Rio Branco. And then he did a master's in political science at the Sorbonne, if I'm getting this right, in France. And then he did his doctorate in France at the École of the Haute Études, you'll have to pronounce it for me, EHESS. So anyway, I could go on and on, but I'll stop there and just say, Carlos, thanks for doing this. We all have a lot of questions. I think you're going to talk for about 20 minutes and then, or half an hour as you wish, and then we'll open it up for questions. We have had Zoom bombings at 2 of our events out of the last 3. The last one was fine. We had a really nasty one recently, just a week ago. And so if that happens, what we will do is we will shut it down if we can't get rid of the person. And then we'll email everybody a new link over the CSSN listserv, because it looks like everybody here is, or virtually everybody is a CSSN scholar. So we apologize about that. If we have to do that, we've taken some security measures this time. I think it's going to go fine, but we get a little nervous. So, and thanks to Stephanie for helping with that work and with worrying about how to avoid it. So Carlos, you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot, Timmons, for organizing this. Nice introductory words, too many words. I'll try to be very objective and go to some points and then open up for Q&A. I've written a text not to get lost with so much information because, as you know, we are in the transition period from Bolsonaro's administration towards the new administration that will begin as of January the 1st. And there are, I think, 31 technical groups working in this transition team, many of them dealing with environment, sustainable development, the Amazon, original peoples, climate, etc. Talking about Brazil post-Bolsonaro, or whatever that means, I think that I'd like to develop an argument that is twofold. I think that a post-Bolsonaro Brazil will still need to deal with the rampant, ultra-conservative, social, political, and religious values embraced by a wide range of the electorate, as we could see in the results of the elections. It will need to deal with science, vaccine, climate denial spread in many social and economic sectors, who defend a conception of development based on a zero-sum game between growth and social environmental justice. That is why, and I come to the second part of my argument, I think there is a kind of a bifurcation within the climate political field in Brazil. I do not intend to say that it's only in Brazil, but I'm just talking about Brazil. On the one hand, a kind of a pragmatic approach, mainly focusing on reducing emissions, focusing on, for example, energy efficiency and transition programs, technological innovations in agribusiness, the use of green hydrogen in Brazil. And on the other hand, those who defend that this new administration would need to rethink Brazil's development model, right? I belong in the second group, since I believe that the climate and social environmental crisis is above all a discussion of development, power relations, climate justice, and international political economy, right? Just for you to situate me in this debate. And I'll try to bring three major points introduction here with you. Just bear with me because I'll be reading. I wrote a text just to be more precise and go directly to the points. First, I think that when we talk about a post-Bolsonaro critical juncture, we need to analyze his legacy. And we don't know yet how awful that legacy is, because the 31 transition technical groups are they are working, right? What we know so far, what have we inherited from his administration? Some points. Strong governors, senators, federal deputies were elected in October this year. And they still defend Bolsonaro and his legacy of deconstruction or destruction, if you prefer. Many of them see the results of these presidential elections just as a parenthesis. They think they may be able to come back. And of course, we cannot anticipate that future. Some examples of this legacy of deconstruction that these strong politicians defend in the field of climate would include, of course, first, the issue of deforestation, right? And here you can see a curve, which is dramatic because it shows that between 2004 and 2014, deforestation had fallen by 80% approximately, going from a range of 1.5 to 3 million hectares per year to 5,000 hectares per year. And since then, it has risen since 2015, still under Dilma Rousseff's second mandate. It has risen again, and today it is around 1.5 million hectares deforested per year, of which 94% are illegally deforested areas. Around 40% of these deforested areas are in the state of Pará, which has something like 6 million hectares of vacant land, that is, land without allocation by the state, right? That is the reason why land ownership is an issue in the Amazon too. And this opens space for invasions, for deforestation, of course, aiming at mineral extraction, agribusiness activities, including in protected indigenous lands. As you can see, this other slide, which shows, deforestation in indigenous lands within the legal Amazonia in Brazil, which has regained this growing curve. Early this week, right, this exact week, the National Institute of Spatial Research and its PRODIS system, which is a system that has been established in order to publish alarming figures related to deforestation. It published new data saying that the deforestation area in the Brazilian Amazon was approximately 11.5 square kilometers between August 21 and July 22, a territory equivalent to that of Qatar, since we're in the middle of the World Cup, or Jamaica, if you want something more, closer to us. Compared to 2021, there was, it's true, an 11% reduction in the pace of deforestation between 2020 to 2021 and 2022. However, if we consider Bolsonaro's 4-year mandate, the average deforestation rate was 11,500 square kilometer, an increase of almost 60% compared to the average observed in the Dilma second mandate / Temer administration, right? Which is enormous. This is the highest, in fact, this is the highest percentage increase in a presidential term since measurements began in 1981. Federal states of Amazonas and Mato Grosso have joined Pará, because in the state of Amazonas, deforestation was not that relevant in comparison to other federal states, but now Amazonas and Mato Grosso have joined Pará as the most devastated states. And it's interesting to see the next slide, because encouraging environmental deforestation won votes for President Jair Bolsonaro in the regions that most deforested the Amazon, including the so-called, as you can see, the arc between Acre in the very west to Maranhão on the very east. There is an arc of deforestation, you know, these greens that you can see. The red is where Lula won the election in the first round of the elections. And the blue is where Bolsonaro won. And it's not a coincidence that you see Bolsonaro winning in areas of environmental degradation, environmental pressure. This is what proves a comparison between an electoral map, right, and the points of greatest environmental pressure. This was done by Instituto Socioambiental and published by Brasil de Fato, a newspaper here in Brazil, which is not very, very, very known, but it's read by progressive people. And Instituto Socioambiental stressed that this overlap between Bolsonarism and environmental crime is not by chance. Environmental crime profited more during the Bolsonaro administration and increased investment in politicians who boost Bolsonaro's legacy. And this is a new, more sophisticated reality of criminal networks in the Brazilian Amazon, which was not there 20 years ago when Lula started his first mandate in 2003. Of course, deforestation represents an obvious threat to Brazil's rainforest in the Amazon, but also the Atlantic forest and other biodiverse biomes such as Cerrado, the Brazilian savanna, Pampa, Caatinga, and the Pantanal. But there are other ingredients of this legacy, this tragic legacy, apart from deforestation, and they would include the violation of the rights of traditional and indigenous peoples, the breaking up of public environmental management system, such as the dismantling of command and control bodies such as IBAMA or ICMBio. I can come to the detail later on in the debate if you wish, and the banning of civil society participation in the processes of discussion and formulation of policies. Another element is also, and this has to do with the agenda that CSSN fosters, is the promotion and the circulation of a wide range of fake news and disinformation on WhatsApp, Telegram, and other social media. In connection with this, another sector hardest hit by the Bolsonaro government was science and technology. This administration has limited transfers of resources from the National Fund for Scientific Development to science and research entities. In practice, this action taken during this year, freezes resources until 2026 and stifles the production of national research in Brazil. The current president of the Brazilian Society for the Progress of Science, Professor Renato Janine Ribeiro, recalled that in addition to budget cuts, Bolsonaro campaigned against science in order to try to undermine the morale of public higher education, which concentrates the production of science in Brazil, culture, and public health. Bolsonaro has been very critical of Brazilian universities and his networks disseminated lies in that public universities are places of disorder, confusion, and sex. I mean, just to remind some of the lies that were disseminated by his networks. Not less meaningful, because we can't forget this, the military in government who have been even more present than ever in the public administration in general, but also in the Brazilian Amazon in particular. Paradoxically, the military implemented in 2019 and in 2020 security, quote unquote, security operations known as Law and Order Guarantee Operations, GLO, right? The first one was named the Green Brazil, very green, and the second was Green Brazil #2. And in 2021, they started Operation Samaúma. And the alleged goal of these operations was to protect the Indians, prevent deforestation. This is what was the promise. However, deforestation and violation of human rights in the Amazon are more and more associated with this very sophisticated development of criminal networks in the region. I wouldn't have any empirical evidence to support that, but there are some, hypotheses to be developed for future research to measure and analyze the links between the military and the criminal networks, of course. A last point concerning this legacy, the institutions, right? There is a very recent study published by Talanoa Institute saying that 401 acts of the federal executive branch between 2019 and 2022 must be revoked or revised immediately. I mean, January the 1st, for the reconstitution of the Brazilian climate and environmental agenda. 401 acts. The Bolsonaro administration worked like an institutional termite. I was looking for this cupim word in English. I don't know if that's the correct one. The termite as a tool for institutional deconstruction. And how? Through infralegal measures, such as decrees, ordinances, normative instructions, among others, that have established changes in the structure, competences, and arrangements of main social, environmental, and climate institutions. Therefore, regulatory signals have become fuzzy and confusing in various climate-related fields, such as biodiversity, the environment, energy, fisheries, mineral industry, agribusiness, land ownership, forest protection, indigenous rights, etc., etc. In a nutshell, I don't know how much time I have already spoken. In a nutshell, under Bolsonaro, Brazil moved away from emission reduction targets, pushing the Amazon closer to its point of no return and leaving the historically most vulnerable populations even more exposed to increasingly frequent extreme events and under a greater burden. Now, very, very briefly, because I mean, we should see, I don't know, 100 pages of this legacy, but that's not the purpose here. Well, and then second point that I'd like to talk about with you here today, with Lula's narrow win last October, because you recall the figures, right? Not even 51% of the result of the polls. Is there hope for this post-Bolsonaro moment? Well, yes, let's be optimistic because we don't have another window of opportunity, perhaps, but there is lots of work to be done. Lula has presented himself as a pro-climate leader, nationally, regionally, and globally in the last COP27, right? Both in his victory speech and in the COP27 address, where he participated at the invitation of the Egyptian government, Lula emphasized the centrality that environmental and climate policies will have in his government, that a new climate agency, a kind of a climate national authority, will sit at the highest level of public administration. He has also announced, and this is very important, a new ministry of Brazil's original peoples, probably with Sônia Guajajara as minister for this new ministry. He proposed to hold COP30 in Brazil, possibly in Pará. The president-elect emphasized Amazon deforestation, the importance of multilateralism and global governance, and the need to give due attention to climate justice with specific policies for countries that are most vulnerable. Something that was interesting in these two speeches that he made, he associated climate justice with food security, right? Trying to recuperate his campaigns for food security during his two first mandates in the early 2000s. He also proposed a new coalition of the South, including Brazil together with Indonesia and Congo as defenders of tropical forests. But to conclude, this is my third and final point. As you can see, my list of optimism is still very narrow. It's a short list because we are just at the beginning and the situation is not so easy. Because moving from administration rooted in denial and rooted in a profile of a pariah state in international, multilateral, and regional affairs to a climate leader, even if we are very optimistic, we have to recognize that the challenges are huge, right? Half a century after the creation of the first Special Secretariat for the Environment in Brazil in 1973, 3 decades after the UN conference in Rio, right? And almost 20 years since the beginning of the most successful plan to reduce deforestation in tropical forests, perhaps in the world, the PPCDAM, right, created in 2004 here in Brazil. Challenges include, among other issues, and I'll just list them and we can come to organizing them in the debate if you wish. The Lula administration will have to deal with a broad political coalition in government and a very conservative Congress, both in the Senate and in the federal chamber. The Lula administration will have to restore participation and social control and transparency. It will have to deal with the fiscal crisis and the idea that has been constitutionalized under Temer before Bolsonaro of a public spending ceiling that can't be surpassed. Even if you have the money to spend, you can't because of the ceiling that has been defined. Another big challenge is how to reduce incentives for fossil fuels, because this also has to do with the federative pact with the federate states. The Lula administration will have to gain confidence of agribusiness sectors that are very pro-Bolsonaro and to promote a big change in the sector's anti-environment profile. Look at this figure, these maps, right, which show the invasion of agribusiness, agropecuária in deep purple into the Amazon. Here you see the same picture in 2 different historical moments and the alarming, the impressive presence of agribusiness all over the main Brazilian biomes. The Lula administration will also have to restore the national climate governance structure and funds, right? What we call here the National Policy of Climate Change, established in 2009, which has been completely discharacterized under Bolsonaro. Regulate the carbon market, integrate the ocean and the climate agendas, fight for climate environmental justice, implement adaptation and preventive measures against climate extreme events and environmental disasters, which have become more and more regular and frequent in Brazil. Fight against impunity. See these rates of payment of environmental fines in Brazil. They have never been so good, but they have gotten even worse, right? In yellow, you see the total of fines that are applied, and in purple, you see what has actually been paid by those who were fined, right? I mean, this is in pure impunity, which dates back to many other years, not only under Bolsonaro, right? Fight against ramping criminalization in the Brazilian Amazon too, particularly when it comes to murdering of environmental activists and people who fight for land ownership. Amerindians, quilombolas, local communities. Brazil is top 5, top 3, in fact, together with Colombia and the Philippines in murder of environmental activists worldwide. I'll just stop this because we don't need this anymore. Brazil will have finally to deeply revise its nationally determined contribution that should be seen as a domestic regulatory signaling instrument to markets and governments. It needs to inspire action and help qualify our development. It does not do so currently. And I think that in view of these very difficult and political times that we are approaching in 2023, even with lots of optimism, because at least we don't have Bolsonaro anymore in front of us, 23 is very difficult. 2023 is very different from 2003, when Lula started his first mandate. And it seems that foreign policy will again play a major role in Brazil's reconstruction of its bridge building profile in climate negotiations. Two focuses, just to conclude. I think that regionally, the new government will change. I think this is going to be interesting to follow next year in 2004, etc. The Pan-Amazonia will gain a political momentum. Perhaps Mercosur will lose a little bit of its relevance, and the Pan-Amazonia and the Treaty of Cooperation among Amazonian states will gain a momentum. The new government should ratify the regional agreement on access to information, public participation, and justice in environmental matters in Latin America and the Caribbean, known as the Escazú Agreement, which is a mechanism to ensure greater public participation in environmental decisions in environmental justice. I think that Brazil will invest in the region with this climate environmental. But in global affairs, the situation is not so easy. Let's see what will happen with bilateral relations with Washington. Apparently, Lula is coming in December to have meetings before his inauguration with Biden. For example, green hydrogen. There are lots of hopes for investment in green hydrogen by the US in Brazil. The consolidation of the Northeast region as a wind energy generation hub perhaps favors the region as a hub for the production of green hydrogen. One of the sectors that run after green hydrogen is steel industry. Another one is transport. The Brazilian Embraer, for example, is developing technology to use green hydrogen in its aircrafts. Another issue of concern is the relationship with the EU, the European Union, because we have a trade agreement that has been signed but has not been ratified. And will this agreement be ratified next year? Because of the environmental concerns that many European countries, particularly France, had put forward during the Bolsonaro administration, this is a question mark. Two geopolitical issues may also put some problems to the Lula administration. First one is the China-US rivalry, right? And Brazil is part of the BRICS. Right. And then what kind of profile will Brazil play? I mean, hoping to have a partnership with the Democrats in the US and being part of the BRICS. China is a key country in terms of trade and investment in Brazil too, right? And the other one has to do with the war in Ukraine, because Russia is part of the BRICS. And of course, I mean, what kind of geopolitical pressure will Russia play in this chessboard? We don't know yet. And how will Brazil react in terms of what kind of agency will Brazil's foreign policy have? We don't know it yet, right? And finally, I think that we cannot forget the transnational corporate sector. The new Lula government, I was discussing this with Guy one of these days, will have to have very serious conversations too with foreign trade and investment partners, so as to ensure that their activities in the country should not contribute to illegal deforestation in the Amazon, but also in other biomes. While, of course, many of us are optimistic about Lula's return, I fear that perhaps there is too much emphasis on what Brazil has to do nationally without considering how the international partners, I mean, public and corporate partners, trade, commercial partners, directly and indirectly contribute to deforestation. For example, meat producers, supermarkets, and how consumers drive their demand. Surely, these actors have a role to play, and I think that, I mean, the burden shouldn't fall on Brazil alone, because the domestic dimension is not so easy for Lula in this new, very broad coalition that he will have to run as of 1st of January. Well, sorry, I spoke too much, but in a nutshell, that's what I wanted to say as a message. Thanks a lot.
Carlos, that was fabulous, and I think you should submit it immediately to Foreign Affairs, or a journal like that. All right, so I'm going to take the first question, and because I have an important one. But I want to encourage people to put their hands up and ask away after me. So I have two, actually. The first is, I was in Pará in 1989 and 90 under Sarney and Collor, and saw the impunity by which deforestation and oppression of local people was happening, and really was impressed by Lula's and Marina Silva's work to decrease deforestation and create a frontier with some law. So I'm curious, my first question sort of is, where does Lula's focus on climate come from? Like, why does he care? So if you can sort of say where, he's shown in the past that he is dedicated to, preserving the Amazon, protecting local peoples and so on. But I think it would be good to hear a little bit about that. Like, why is he sort of elevating climate right now as he talks about his transition and so on, including in the 31 transition teams that you mentioned? And the second question really focuses on our Climate Social Science Network core question, and that is, what are the obstruction strategies that have been used on climate, to slow climate action in Brazil? And especially, how do you think those are going to pivot? How do you think sectors like business and so on will pivot under a new administration? What will be their new strategies, or will they be just old strategies to slow and stop climate action in Brazil?
Should I just answer now and then we go?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead. Yeah, if you're ready.
Yeah, let me start with the second one. I think that, of course, obstructing actors will lose power because they will not control the public administration, the federal public administration anymore. And in our research here in Brazil on denial and obstruction in the field of climate, we have already reached the conclusion that holding the pen and the power of the public administration has been key for the dissemination of disinformation, fake news, and obstruction strategies by these actors and networks. However, Governor of São Paulo, was elected, and São Paulo is a key federate state. And one of the hints that many people are thinking about is that perhaps São Paulo, I mean, representing roughly 35% of our GDP, will concentrate, and more than that, will welcome those actors as part of its public administration. It's a key country, I mean, a key federal state. We cannot forget that.
No.
And Bolsonaro won in many other federal states too. I mean, he's got lots of support from some governors. This may change. Because there are bargains, I mean, there are negotiations all the time. Political parties are not so ideological sometimes. They are very pragmatic to get access to funds. Federal government is important in disseminating and decentralizing funds. But I think that one hint I would add at is that São Paulo perhaps will become a key hub for that. And obstruction strategies, I think that the use of fake news, disseminating disinformation, this will continue to happen, right? What will be the role of religious networks is yet to be followed, because the big ministers of the neo-Pentecostals in Brazil are also very pragmatic, right? And they may change their positioning in the negotiations with the new Lula administration. One of them has already signaled that he wanted to support the Workers' Party in this mandate, right? I mean, they are extremely pragmatic. But what will happen in the obscure fields that we, I mean, under the table, as we say here in Brazil, is something that we'll have to keep on researching. And I think that São Paulo is going to be, it's good to see Maggie here because she's at Unicamp. And then I think that São Paulo is going to be a key area and focus of research to be followed. Why is Lula elevating climate? I think that there are many reasons for that. I mean, I would just put forward some hypotheses. First, because Brazil is a key country in this global, I mean, climate fight, right? I mean, and I think that Lula recognizes that. He got the support from Marina in the second round of the elections, right? And in the environment transition team, you have Marina, Carlos Mink, Isabella Teixeira, just to name a few of the former great ministers that we had, right? And I think that all of them are giving this emphasis that through the climate debate, and I think that all the three, I'm together with them because all the three, they consider that talking about climate in Brazil is talking about development model, right? It's how do you reshape the Brazilian development model so that you integrate climate not in a zero-sum game with the economy, right? And I think that this is strategic for you to rethink how agribusiness should behave. For example, in one of his speeches, Lula said, we don't need to deforestate. We have already lots of lands that have been degraded. We just need to do research in order to recuperate these lands for the sake of agriculture, right? And for the sake of agribusiness. And then he invites, this is interesting because he invites agribusiness sector in order to invest in more research in order to recuperate the lands and not in order to deforestate new lands, which is the easiest formula, of course. But again, I think that in spite of all these great figures, Marina, Isabella Teixeira, Carlos Mink, etc., the situation is very difficult because of the ramping criminality in the Amazon. I think that we have never had so many criminal networks, not only national, installed, deployed there in the Amazon. And I think this is going to be a key challenge, to fight against.
Thanks, Carlos. Who's next? Put up your hand if you'd like to ask a question. There's some of you I can count on to ask questions. And if you don't, then I will keep asking questions. So watch out.
We've got some questions in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Who do you want to tell us who was first. Maggie.
Maggie said just hello. Let me see, there is a question.
Do we want to read yours out, Maggie, or would you like to ask it? Yeah, go ahead.
I can ask. Very nice to see you here, Professor Milani, always a pleasure. And I would like you to talk a little more about the consortium of governors of the Amazonian states, which were, that was one coalition that kind of saved a little the conversation, the debate about environment in Brazil during the Bolsonaro years, because Bolsonaro wouldn't do anything, but the governors of the Amazonian states got together to try to counterpose like the destruction and deconstruction of Bolsonaro. And I would like to know now during the Lula years, what do you think the role of this coalition will be? And if it's going to have an international presence, like an important international weight, and if it can face up to the environmental crime, like to the organized crime here domestically. Thank you.
Thanks, Maggie. I think there are two consortia that were important, right? The Amazon one and the Northeastern region one. I mean, the Amazon consortium of federal states and local mayors, focusing more on deforestation and the protection of the rainforest, and the Northeastern coalition of governors and mayors, focusing on the production of renewable energies, right? I think these two were the regions that played a role, or try to play a role in order to counteract Bolsonaro's measures and policies locally. In the case of the Amazon, I think that it was a signal to see a governor elect Barbalho, I think it's Shader. I always make a confusion between the father and the son. He was together with Lula at COP27, and when Lula, that was interesting, because when Lula announced that he would like to host the COP30 in Brazil, he said, and preferably in the Brazilian Amazonia. And then the camera went back to the governor of Pará, and probably that will take place over there. That being said, I think that there will need, for the Amazon region, lots of investment to recuperate the capacity of IBAMA, ICMBio, the federal police. I don't know how far Lula will be able to count on the military to support that. That's a question mark. But I think that you cannot count only on the local governors and the mayors. They are not that strong, I mean, economically, and you need some more control measures that come from the federal government. And with the fiscal crisis and the economic crisis, then that is my question mark. How able the Brazilian government from the federal level will be able to implement all these countermeasures against criminality in the Amazon. Perhaps by means of international support, the resurrection, so to say, of the Amazonian Fund, with more partners, not only Germany and Norway, but perhaps the US, the UK, many other countries have, Canada, have announced their interest to be part of the Amazonian Fund, which are grants, right, that are put for the use of the federal government, that could kind of compensate for the lack of financial resources available, at least next year, for the federal government in order to implement some measures over there. I think there is Guy here and Kathy.
Yeah, let's go in that order. Guy, can you maybe update your question a little, given what you've heard so far?
reading the future.
Oh, Guy can't talk because he's in the library, but his question says,
I see.
will Marina Silva be environment minister, and how will she manage the climate and environmental agenda against more traditional actors in finance, foreign ministry, energy and agricultural ministries,
Yeah.
who may still see this agenda as a brake on development?
Yeah.
Awesome question.
Thanks. I don't know if she's going to be minister, right? I see Marina much more as the head of this new National Climate Authority, but perhaps she will be minister because she has already been a minister. And I think she would like to have something more with a higher profile. And this National Authority, National Climate Authority, should have a kind of a coordinating role across ministers and sectoral policies. I think that she would see herself much more in that positioning because it would be stronger for her. She would be a kind of a key counselor, kind of a security counselor, but environmental climate counselor to Lula, sitting at the presidency together with him. I think that is more, at least I cannot anticipate the future, but that is how I see the convergence of interests from Marina and Lula to elevate, as Timon said, the climate agenda in Brazil, right? And because I think that she has more international profile, she's very respected, etc. And I think that more, according to her history too, than Isabella and Carlos Mink. But these other two will definitely play a role in this game, I think. But I would see her more in this national authority, because it would perhaps make it less difficult, not easier, but less difficult to have a break on, as you say, on development model and policies in Brazil.
That's really the dream team, isn't it, with Carlos and Isabella Teixeira? Amazing. Kathy.
Yeah, just to comment on what you just said. I mean, the Casa Civil is formally the head of the Comitê Interministerial de Mudança do Clima, so that would be a logical place to put her, rather than in the ministry, which is just one actor in that. But my question is really something that came out of a conversation that I was having last week with a reporter from Estado de São Paulo. He was very interested in sort of the geopolitics of what might happen with Lula. And one thing we started talking about was trade. And, you know, it seemed to me that the WTO was a place where there might actually be some room for Lula to have a real impact. And it's an especially interesting moment for trade, in part because, you know, the WTO is just stalled at the moment. But it's also a moment when the EU, the UK, the US are all developing these governmental supply chain initiatives that are unlike anything we've really seen, and targeting deforestation. And I was at a meeting last week at the Brazilian embassy here in London where they were, you know, clearly most of the people who were there to hear about the UK's new supply chain governance initiative. And so I was wondering, where do you think a Lula administration might fall in all of those conversations about trade? And do you see that as something likely to be a major area where we might see some action that would be relevant to deforestation and therefore climate?
Yeah, thanks for that great question, Kathy. I don't know actually, but I would hint, I would think that the new government would favor working through WTO, because there is this focus on multilateral organizations, and because there is a fear seen from the Brazilian perspective that EU countries, the UK or even the US, when they apply this carbon tax on the frontier, who decides on that? It's not a decision that is multilaterally, built, and having seen this historical trajectory of emphasis that the Brazilian foreign policy puts on multilateralism as the place, as the space, the institutions that you have to foster so that the rules are universal, etc. This resurrection of WTO could be a good bet. I agree with you. The other one could also be the region. Because if there isn't space, if there isn't policy and political space to move the WTO agenda again, because it's stalled, as you said, perhaps there will be a bet on how to build rules regionally through Mercosur, new UNASUR. I mean, many people in the transition team on foreign policy, I know some of them, they have been talking about, for example, an integrated South American market for renewable energies, right? Which is an interesting idea, right? Because you have two key oil producers in South America, right? And how will you build this? It's tricky, right? But they are thinking. I mean, I think there is also a bet of perhaps if WTO does not work as a possibility, work in the region could be another policy and political exit. I don't know.
That's nice. Kathy, any quick follow-up, or can we move over to Will?
The only thing I would just say is that this guy, Ricardo Leopoldo, did a series of interviews with Celso Amorim, Marina, Isabella Teixeira, etc., that he passed on to me. And I don't know if anybody is interested in seeing that. It's about 8 interviews with people on the transition team, but that might be interesting.
Is there a way to post it? Like
Well,
a link to where the heck those ended up? In the
I don't, let me see if I can find that, because he sent me documents, including translations into English, although the translations aren't great. I think the Portuguese is probably better, but I'll see if I can find it and I'll send it to, I guess you and Stephanie, but yeah.
That's fine. Or you could put your email in the chat and people can email you.
Yeah, and people can ask me for it if they want it.
Okay, so I would like to end us up right about the end of the hour, so about 6 more minutes. So Will, you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure, thanks. Carlos, really enjoyed that talk. That's so informative. You've kind of done a really good job for me, certainly, of sketching in how Lula is constrained by some of the legacies of Bolsonaro on, I guess, economics and having to kind of build confidence with economic actors and business actors. And also the political constraints with, conservative supporters of Bolsonaro still in important roles across various levels of governance in Brazil. What I'm interested in is the kind of, you touched on fake news a number of times, and the kind of continuing kind of likely spread of misinformation, disinformation. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that and how you see that might play out, because I'm wondering about how impactful that fake news might be on electorates. And I'm wondering, just kind of communicatively and kind of in terms of public opinion, how constrained Lula is by that legacy of fake news in the kind of public sphere in Brazil.
Thanks, Will, for that question. Well, you have to take into consideration how the Brazilian society gets informed and how they believe news that circulate in WhatsApp and Telegram, for example. And there are some research reports published in the last 2 years that have shown that the Brazilian citizen, the average Brazilian, believes a lot what he or she reads on WhatsApp. Right? There's lots of confidence put by the Brazilian individual agent on what he or she receives on WhatsApp. And I think that our electoral court, the high court that follows up the elections here in Brazil, this year was much more rigid and much more strict in terms of trying to control the dissemination of fake news. Right, the president of the court has asked several times to not only regulation, but he has imposed a ban on the circulation of this news, of that news, and so on Facebook, on WhatsApp, and then the outlets had to respond to that. And I think that it will be very difficult for the Lula administration to initiate any kind of talk on regulation of the social media, right? Because it's difficult in the US, it's almost impossible here in Brazil. But I think that some measures, asking perhaps these outlets to voluntarily decide on some measures not to disseminate or to check the facts. There are lots of NGOs working on fact check here in Brazil. This might help a little bit, but I think it will continue to be a key strategy for the denial obstruction networks in Brazil. because of this kind of sociological dimension of the Brazilian society, which is less formally educated, believe in what they receive, and many of them, I mean, more than 70% of Brazilians, they only read what they receive on WhatsApp. They don't even open a website to read a newspaper, for example.
Wow.
And I think the source of information here is very much dependent on WhatsApp, Telegram, and social media. And that is something that, I mean, sociologically, you have to work in the longer run in order to think of measures that can be efficient and effective to counteract that trajectory.
Wow, that's a pretty shocking figure. Will, you're still on mute, I think.
Right. I'm responding in the same way, Tim. I'm shocked at that, but I'm also really interested. And I mean, maybe not so much newspapers, but I'm wondering about television and radio as kind of media that, you know, where does that sit alongside of people's kind of news and information environment, if you like? Could you?
Both have lost lots of capacity to dialogue with the Brazilian people. I mean, for example, during the election, the campaign here, we had debates, of course, and some of the debates were important, but who was watching TV at that moment? And then we would see that it was 20% of the electorate, right? And the TVs also, they got under the Bolsonaro administration very much, so to say, specialized, because some channels, they are run by the evangelicals. And then what they portray is already, I mean, infused with some sorts of disinformation or new visions of the reality, right? And for example, all of a sudden, many of us progressive people here in Brazil, we were, you know, oh, Global is our partner, you know, I mean, because it was, which is amazing when we think of the history of TV channels in Brazil, right? Because Global was playing a role of just showing science, you know, the role of vaccines, the role of how to fight the pandemic, things like that. Whereas the others were also portraying the other side, you know, well, perhaps the vaccines are not so effective and things like that. And I think that there is a question of the regulatory governance mechanisms of TV channels in Brazil. But in a nutshell, I would say that they have lost the capacity to build lots of public opinion in Brazil, right? I mean, I think that the social media, they are impressive, right? And that is something that is really important. I was talking to some friends at the university one of these days. We were talking about the role of the public intellectuals. We write books, right? But who reads books in this country, right? And what we have to do is to, you know, make a video of 1.5 minutes. But we don't know how to do that, right? And it's really, I mean, it works our minds because we don't know how to get the message across, now how to communicate science. And I think that's a key issue for the future too.
Yeah, Carlos, I mean, I was hearkening back to my time in Pará State in the Amazon on very rough frontier towns, and you would walk down the street and you could literally follow the dialogue of the Globo, the Rede Globo, you know, telenovelas or the news or whatever. Every single TV was watching Globo, every house that had a television. And then the neighbors would come and watch from the window if they didn't have a television. Literally, they dominated the national discourse back in that time. And that was, you know, Lula's first election in 1999. Is that right? No, 1989. So
he was elected.
Yeah. So we need to thank you and encourage you to do more on this. And again, I think this would be a fantastic article for foreign affairs or foreign policy, and we hope you'll push it out there. And we, as your CSSN colleagues, look forward to working with you and would like to support you in all you're doing. And you too, Maggie, and everybody else in Brazil working at this really important time. And I heard a little bit of optimism in there with a lot of caution about the difficult social conjuncture that you all are facing in Brazil. So we hope for the best, really. And again, as scholars, hopefully we can support each other. And I just want to say I'm very impressed with your speaking out through the whole last 4 years. So thank you for that.
Thank
So,
you.
and thank you for this event today. And we'll have a recorded version that we'll put up, right, Stephanie? It'll be up on the cssn.org site very soon, maybe in a day or two. So again, Carlos, that was fantastic. Everybody take care. I look forward to working with everybody. So
Thank you. Bye-bye.
take care.